Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer with Preeclampsia. May is Preeclampsia Awareness Month, and we wanted to do some educational videos to answer some of the most common questions we get about preeclampsia and to help raise awareness. Now, one of the questions we get often is what counts as a risk factor and why is something a risk factor? Now, the overall rate of preeclampsia is about 8% or 1 in 12. So let's imagine that we could get all of the women who gave birth in the last year together in one giant stadium. Now obviously these are millions of women. We couldn't actually do this, but let's just imagine that we could. We've got all the women who gave birth within the last year together in one stadium. Now that we've done that, we start dividing them into groups. We say, if this was your first pregnancy, go one way, and if this was a second or later pregnancy, go the other. So all the first pregnancies are over there. All of the second or later go over there. And then we say, if you had preeclampsia, raise your hand. And what you'll find is that there are women in both groups that raise their hands. But the percentage of women who had it in first pregnancy is actually around 10%, whereas in the group that had had a previous pregnancy, it's only about 1%. So since the first pregnancy is higher than the average, we count that as a risk factor. Now we start looking at this group over here that had previous pregnancies. We ask them, if you had preeclampsia in a previous pregnancy, go one way. If you had a normal previous pregnancy, go the other way. So we divide them up again. And what we find is that in this group that had a normal previous pregnancy, there are still a few that raise their hand, but it's actually less than 1%. Whereas in this group that already had preeclampsia once, it's about 20%. Since 20% is quite a bit bigger than our average, having a previous history of preeclampsia is counted as a risk factor. Now, there are lots of ways that we could divide this group up. We could divide them by age. We could say, if you are a teenager, go in one way. If you're in your 20s, if you're in your 30s, if you're over 40. And when we ask them to raise their hands, again, you'll see hands in all groups. But there is a larger percentage among the teenagers and a larger percentage in the over 40s. So both of these are considered risk factors. We could also divide people up by weight. We could say if you were underweight, normal weight, overweight, obese, divide into groups. And again, you will see people raising their hands in all four categories. There will be slightly more in the overweight and obese compared to the normal weight and the underweight. Now, a lot of times we'll have people say, well, weight is a risk factor, obesity is a risk factor, but I wasn't obese, so how can obesity be a risk factor? Or in the other direction, that lady I know who's super fat and she's super unhealthy and she does all the wrong things, but she had a normal pregnancy. How can an obesity be a risk factor if skinny people get it and some fat people don't? Well, it's not necessarily a cause. Being overweight doesn't necessarily cause preeclampsia. If it did, then we would expect more people that were overweight to get it. But it's about the percentage. If it's higher than that average, it's counted as a risk factor. It doesn't mean that thin people don't get preeclampsia, that only overweight people do. It just means that more overweight people get it compared to the normal weight and underweight. So I hope this helps you understand a little more about what counts as a risk factor and how we find out what is a risk factor. There are a lot of different risk factors. We can divide this group of women up in a lot of different ways. We can divide them up based on whether they have chronic hypertension or not. For the group that has chronic hypertension, it's about 25%. Or we can divide them up as to whether or not they used artificial reproduction techniques. That group is about 15%. If a certain group has a rate that's higher than the average, it's counted as a risk factor. So let me know in the comments what you think, if you have any questions, if you have other questions that you would like covered in future videos, and I hope you have a wonderful day.